Well, good morning, everyone. I've got 10:30, so I think we're going to go ahead and get rolling here. My name is Daryl Timmerman, serve on the board of directors with Minnesota Pork, and I'm sort of the distinct honor and privilege of introducing our next session that we have here this morning. So this next session is at the intersection of societal pressures, consumer acceptance, and industry adoption. So technological advancements continue to present opportunities in agriculture, including the pork industry. Today's seminar will go beyond the surface, delving into the intricacies and multifaceted advantages of gene editing, and will provide a comprehensive understanding of the potential benefits this technology brings to the forefront of modern agriculture. It's my pleasure to introduce Randy Riley, co-owner of Golden Sun Insights. Randy, if you want to go ahead and hop on up here and get started, and I'll let you maybe elaborate a little bit more about yourself, and we'll go from there.
Appreciate it. Yep. Thank you. So, good morning. This is not a very boisterous crowd. Are people going to trickle in? I hope. So it's good to be with y'all here today. This is my first time in Mankato, Minnesota, and I'll tell you real quickly, I met Jill Ressler. Am I saying it right, Ressler? I've always just called her Jill. A few months ago, she was referred to by Jerry Flint, who sits on the National Pork Board. I participated in an event back at the World Pork Expo over the summer along the same lines around gene editing. Jill was in participation and said that this is a really hot topic in your industry and thought it'd be good to participate in the event this year to talk a little bit about gene editing. So, as mentioned before, my name is Randy Riley. I work for an organization called Golden Sun Insights. Basically, we're a strategy-centric firm that operates in the fresh fruit and vegetable industry. We help growers and shippers and producers of fruits and vegetables to take their products to market. And I'll elaborate that here in a little bit. But before Golden Sun, I spent 29 years at grocery retail, 10 with the chain called Winn-Dixie, and then 19 with the Kroger Company. My last 5 years at Kroger, I led the fruit and vegetable operation with responsibilities over sales planning, category management, and procurement. So when you think about our organization, again, we work with producers and growers and marketers in the fresh fruit and vegetable industry, helping them to bring their products to market, okay? We help them with things such as strategy, such as business development. We have a marketing arm to our company that helps them bring their products to market, and then we help them with category management and services of that kind. I dwell on this just simply because when you think about those that we work with, we stretch across what we call the produce value chain. So we work with genetics, we work with breeders, we work with physical growers, just about every category within the produce space, all the way up to retail. We work with a couple of retailers in many different ways. Some of the things that we do at Golden Sun on behalf of our clients is we try to bridge a relationship with the nation's top retailers across the country. And that's important to us because, as you know, the consumer demand helps to dictate how retailers go to market, but only to a certain degree. A lot of grocers and retailers want to establish their way of going to market. And so they're our targeted customer. And when I say our, I'm talking about not only our company, but on behalf of the clients that we work with. And we try to understand how each retailer goes to market so that we can come back and assist our clients in building a compelling narrative to put in front of the retailers in order to optimize their business, okay? So that's who we are, the Cliff Notes version anyways. So, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, Jill asked that we talk a little bit about gene editing. And so I think before we go down this road, there's some groundwork I want to lay. Number one, I am not a scientist. I'm not a biologist. I don't understand the full intricacies of gene editing. What I do know, though, is that through research that our company performs periodically on this subject matter, What we do know is that there is what? Mass confusion, great misunderstandings, and folks are misaligned on the benefits and advantages of gene editing, okay? And so my hope is that you're not sitting there saying, well, if you don't know anything about gene editing, why are you up there talking about gene editing? And the purpose of this is to say there are processes of and a rollout of gene-edited products in the fresh produce space that we have done quite a bit of research on to study, to understand, and then to hope to draw some conclusions and parallels on the plight that you're going down here in the pork industry, okay? As I understand it, this is a subject matter that is pretty controversial in your space. As I understand it, it's pretty polarizing in your space. And I would say equally in the fresh fruit and vegetable space, it is as controversial and polarizing, but there does seem to be some level of acceptance, okay? Not only with the retailer, but also with the end consumer. And as I understand some of the complexities that exist within the pork industry is there's this massive amount of apprehension and wanting to roll out a process called gene editing in your industry. And so what we hope to do is say, why is there some acceptance in fresh fruits and veg? And what conclusions and parallels can we draw in hopes to make that a bit more seamless and easier for you in your industry? Sound good? Okay, so like anything, I think it may be super important for us to try to lay the groundwork and come to a clear consensus on definitions of gene editing. And I'm getting to a point here, so work with me. But when you think about gene editing, in its simplest definition form, it's making precise, intentional changes to an organism's DNA sequence using molecular tools, okay? This technology allows scientists to add, delete, or replace specific genes within an organism's DNA sequence. And then finally, gene editing can be performed using different molecular tools, and some of the examples are shown right there. I start here to go down a road to say, again, lots of confusion, lots of misunderstanding, lots of folks misalign in terms of gene editing. What do I mean by that? Every other Saturdays, I get my hair cut, okay? From the same lady. She's been cutting my hair for a long time. And so she knows what I do for a living, and she knows I travel a lot. And my hope is that this story that I'm going to tell you, or a couple stories, that you have similar experiences. Well, a couple days ago, she asked me, where am I traveling next? And I told her I'm headed to Mankato, Minnesota. And after the whole, well, where is that? And why do they call themselves that? And yada, yada, yada. We then went down the road of what is the purpose of you being there? And I said, well, I'm going to talk about gene editing. And what was interesting was her response to that. And she said, what is the pork industry doing with GMOs? And I said, wait, no, this is different. Gene editing is different than GMOs. But what's interesting to me is in her mind, she's bolting on this thing called gene editing to this term or this notion called GMOs, okay? A couple weeks ago, I'm with a buddy of mine, and him and his wife, they are health freaks, okay? They work out all the time. They watch everything they eat. They participate in all of those crazy activities where you're running through mud and all of that crazy stuff. And I was explaining to him that I had to come to Minnesota and talk a little bit about gene editing. And his response was interesting. His response was, well, we only eat organic products. And so you're like, really? Are you kidding me? He is differentiating organic with everything else, and everything else incorporates these terms like gene editing and GMO. So I go down this road to tell those two stories just to essentially say, again, so much confusion, so much misunderstandings, and folks are misaligned on the process. So in order to try to level set us as a group, I think it may be good just to say, what is the difference between gene editing and GMO? If we were to simplify it as much as possible, what is the major difference between them? Well, as we mentioned earlier, gene editing is precise modification of an organism's DNA using molecular tools. It allows for intentional changes to specific genes with high precision, and scientists can add, delete, or replace genes within the sequence, right? Where GMO is allowing foreign DNA. Right? And that's the big difference. GMO foreign, gene editing within the original DNA structure. And so one person explained to me years ago that a best way to illustrate what gene editing is to people who don't really know it, it's essentially turning light switches on and off within the DNA structure, right? Where GMO, you're bringing in other stuff. And so then it makes you ask, does that make it more acceptable? Does that make it less polarizing? And I think the answer is somewhat yes. And we'll work through some examples of that. So in my conversations with my friend and his wife, what we talked about is this thing called gene editing and GMO. It's relatively new. There's a lot of suspicion and controversy with it. But what we had to understand is this process is around us in many different ways. We partake in this process called gene editing in many different ways. Whether it's through biotech, where we see that gene editing can be used to create new products and materials, including biofuels, including bioplastics, industrial enzymes. We know that gene editing exists in the drug industry, and it has for a long time, where gene editing enables the creation of more accurate disease models, right? Allowing researchers to study diseases and test potential therapies more effectively. As we understand it, it's been in the livestock industry for quite some time, where gene editing can be used to enhance livestock by introducing desirable traits such as resistance to disease, improved growth rate, possible increased meat production, milk production, so on and so forth. And we know it's been in agriculture, specifically in fruits and vegetables for quite some time, simply to improve crop yields, disease resistance, resistance to pests and other diseases, and to increase the nutritional value of the crops that's being grown. And so I wanted to start this whole dissertation by saying gene editing, polarizing, confusing, but it exists in the produce space, and there seems to be some level of acceptance. And so the question becomes is, why is there a level of acceptance? And I wanted to walk through a couple of things that we see as advantages or benefits that come from gene editing in the fresh produce space, okay? And remember, our mission here is to say, are there some conclusions or parallels that we can draw from these slides into the pork industry? And the first one is gene editing in the fresh produce space is for food security. What do I mean by that? Well, we know that there's quite a few tests and even initiated rollouts of gene-edited products that are simply to solve this notion of improved crop yield. It's used to modify genes associated with crop yield, leading to the development of plants with higher productivity. Put yourself in the in the shoes of a farmer of fresh produce, where that person can have a plant that produces more yield without any more additional inputs. There's a benefit to that as associated to food security. In addition to that, by editing genes, we know that there's enhanced pest and disease resistance. So by editing genes that confer resistance to pests and diseases, crops can be made more resilient, which reduces the risk of crop losses, ensuring a more reliable food supply. Also, there is an adaptation to climate change. Gene editing allows for the development of crops that are more resilient to the effects of climate change, such as increased temperatures, droughts, whatever the case may be. And so when you think about it from a social economic standpoint, you see that there's some level of acceptance with gene editing in the fresh and fruit industry because it is attaching itself in terms of a benefit to food security, okay? The other benefit. Gene editing provides for nutrition and flavor enhancement. What do we mean by that? Well, gene editing can be utilized to enhance the nutritional content of crops, right? Addressing issues related to nutrient deficiencies. For example, the modification of vitamin levels in fruits and vegetables can have positive implications for human health. Think about it. About a decade ago, there seemed to be this cult following for kale and carrots. Do you remember this? Where a lot of people were consuming increased levels of kale, increased level of carrots. They were making kale salads. They were juicing kale and carrots. They were using carrots in every recipe. And the purpose of that was because they saw that those two items were nutrient dense, okay? And there was a bit of a demand from the consumer that engaged in those activities to say what other items in the fresh fruit and vegetable space is nutrient dense because we want to partake of them. And so gene editing allows the opportunity to explore nutrient-dense products. In addition to that, it also provides an opportunity for enhanced flavor profiles, meaning this technology allows for precise modifications to the genetic material of the crops, enhancing their taste and profiles. And we're going to show you some examples of that here in just a second. But notice that those two are really consumer-facing, okay? And we'll come back to that. The other advantage of gene editing in the produce space is under this umbrella of sustainability. And we know that sustainability is a big buzzword right now. Every retailer has a sustainability initiative. They're looking to attach themselves to industries or suppliers or producers who have a sustainability program that matches their initiative. And what we see here is that gene editing allows for the development of crops with enhanced resistance to pests and diseases. We talked a little bit about this. This in turn minimizes the environmental impact associated with that pesticide use. I mean, think about it. If I'm able to reduce my environmental impact by not increasing any inputs and also reducing my footprint while increasing my yields, that's optimal, and gene editing allows for that in the fresh produce space. In addition to that, it helps with increased crop resilience. We talked a little bit about that, but also it's improved resource use efficiency. And so my point on this example is to say sustainability, again, a great big buzzword in our space, and gene editing allows for that to come to fruition a bit more than if not. And then finally, we know the benefits of gene editing, generally speaking, is precision and speed. But how it impacts the fresh produce space is that gene-edited techniques provide a high degree of precision in modifying the genetic makeup of plants, which is really different than the perception of a GMO process, right? Lots of GMO in the fruit and vegetable space, and I think that's what's causing the cloud of suspicion, generally speaking, while this process allows that to be a little more refined. And then also, it accelerates the breeding process. So in the fresh fruit and vegetable space, we have a new variety of something coming out all the time. I mean, think about apples. You walk into a grocery store and you see 30 different varieties of apples. And those apples, the breeding process takes forever, right? When you graft one tree into another, this is decades long of research and a process that is overwhelming, where gene-edited process allows you to speed up time. So another benefit, another advantage of gene editing. So what are we saying here? If you were to take everything that I just said and start to list out all of the advantages of this process in the fresh fruit and vegetable space, what we see is some significant things. It improves crop yield. It enhances pest and disease resistance. There's an adaptation to climate change. It optimizes the resource use. There's a reduction of food waste. There's a diversification of the crop. It reduces dependency on pesticides, faster crop development, stabilizes the global food supply. These are all great things that the science can do for our industry. But it's still met with some resistance, right? And then, if we try to create a parallel to your industry and start to list out all the benefits, I'm sure we can come up with a similar, very reasonable and attractive list. The question becomes, though, is who is the one that's really resistant to this process? And we know it's ultimately the end consumer. And so how do they view this in the produce industry? What is their rate of acceptance? And what I would argue is, generally, it's starting to become pretty favorable. And then the question is why? And it's really because I think of these 6 things. Consumers are starting to see the products in their produce departments that are causing some of these things that touches their senses, okay? We talked a little bit about nutrient enhancement. Many consumers are looking for nutrient-dense products. They want more than kale and carrots, and they believe that a process called gene editing will provide that. They're looking for a longer shelf life. We're all guilty of the notion that when we go to the grocery store and buy produce and put it on our counter, and when it spoils after 1 or 2 days, we're pretty upset, and we want a solve to that. And there seems to be some understanding from the consumer level that gene editing can provide that. There's also the reduction of pesticides. We talked about that a couple times. There's cost benefits. If there's improved yield without any additional inputs, typically the consumer enjoys that saving. There's climate resilience, and then it's a possible source to answer this food crisis, or a solution to answer this food crisis. So let's look at some examples that exist within the produce space. And some of these you're probably aware of, but to build our case study here, we'll go through each one of them. Here are the items that are in market today. Anybody ever heard of the Arctic apple? One person, the youngest guy in the room. What's the benefit of the Arctic apple? The process of gene editing was able to solve the single biggest issue all of us have with apples after we cut it, which is what? Browning, right? Because when we see the apple's flesh start to brown, what do we think? It's bad, got to throw it away, and I just wasted my money. Gene editing provides a solution to that. Arctic apples started with Granny Smith apples, and they started to roll out to other varieties, and they've solved and curated the world's most problematic issue with apples, okay, theoretically. So it's interesting. You think about it, I'm sure there were benefits upstream, meaning soil, meaning yield, meaning inputs. I'm sure there were some solves, but the consensus on the Arctic apple is that it solved downstream issues, which was quality, waste, experience, okay? Let's look at another example. Anybody here eat eggplant? Okay, good. Italian dishes? Sure. What's the problem with eggplant? You can never go to the grocery store and find a good eggplant. They all have spots on them. They're all misshaped. They come in different sizes. Most of the time, grocery stores don't even carry it because it's high waste. It doesn't turn over a lot, okay? And what the process of gene editing provided is that it got rid of the spots, it grew more consistent in size, and then eggplant brown on the inside just like apples, and it was able to reduce that as well, okay? There is a thing out there called a tearless sweet onion. When we chop onions, what happens? We cry, right? And we don't want to chop onions. Or we modify the onion and we go with other varieties that don't make us cry a lot, okay? And what this process has done is taken out the enzyme that causes one to cry. Now, this is in the marketplace today. Walmart's carrying it, Kroger is carrying it, Costco is carrying it. And when you think about Walmart, Kroger, and Costco, those are the number 1, 2, and 3 retailers in America carrying a gene-edited product in their produce departments, okay? And it's seeing great success. There's multiple brands out there, and the product really works. And then there's the spicy tomato. Have you heard about this one? The tomato carries the gene that causes chili peppers to be hot. But that gene is dormant. Gene-edited process allows that gene to wake up and create a different experience and flavor profile for the consumer. Now, as I purposely slowed down and tried to explain that to you, I was looking across you and I saw a couple of you interested with that. Who doesn't want to try a spicy tomato? That's cool, isn't it? And so what do we have here? Non-browning apple, more aesthetically pleasing eggplant, a tearless onion, and a really cool and sexy spicy tomato. Those are all consumer-driven strategies through gene editing, okay? What's in development? A ground cherry. You ever heard of a ground cherry? Yep. It's like a tomato, right? The plants don't produce a lot, and they're really itty-bitty, and nobody wants to waste their time with it. The process of gene editing is allowing that crop to yield extraordinarily large, and it's allowing the tomatoes to grow to a larger size. This is a great tasting tomato. It puts tomatoes back on the map. And I say back on the map because probably the number one complaint that retailers get with their produce is that the tomatoes taste bad. They're not like the ones that are grown in our backyard. This one will change it in many people's mind. And then finally, mushrooms. Think about how many times you've gone to the grocery store and you looked at the mushroom section and they're all brown. The white mushrooms are brown. There is a gene located inside the mushroom that accelerates that brown color, and scientists believe that they can alter that in order to reduce the color changing of white mushrooms. What do you think about this list? These solve consumer wants and desires. If you think about this, I socialize to you that in fruits and vegetables, while it's solving a lot of upstream challenges, gene editing is being articulated in a sense that it's a consumer-driven strategy, right? Gene editing advancements have increased the nutritional value of whole foods, attributing to the food as medicine principle. It's removing common allergens that are associated with a lot of particularly fruits. And these new varietal developments have improved flavor and increased consumer satisfaction. So I got to believe that this is one of the main thrusts behind why there is a bit of acceptance with gene-edited products in the produce department. Now, let me be clear. I mean, it's not rainbows and unicorns, right? There is still resistance. There are still people who are skeptical about all of this, rightfully so. There's still people, as we described earlier, that are misaligned in terms of definitions and what the differences between gene-edited products and produce are against GMO products and produce, okay? So all that still exists. My intent was not to say it's a yellow brick road and y'all should just move down without any fear or repercussions. But there seems to be some success that we can draw conclusions from. What's the public view, generally speaking, on gene editing and produce? They see it as innovation. Innovation typically has a positive connotation associated with it. They see it as technological advancements, and they're happy because there's a bit of transparency with labeling. Okay, and produce has always been really good at labeling, especially with transparency labeling, whether it's GMO, whether it's organic, whether it's USDA certified to some degree. And we're getting credit in our industry from the consumer on these three things. Now let's look at the pork industry. And let me just say, I'm not a pork expert. I just like to eat pork, lots of pork, but I don't know anything about it. Okay, I don't know how to farm it, the pigs. I don't know what they eat. I don't know how often you have to feed them. I don't know any of that. You do, okay? All I know is what we did in terms of research as it relates to gene editing to see what the benefit that is being stated for your particular industry. And what we're seeing is really these 5 things. If the pork industry, and correct me if I'm wrong, eager to hear, want to debate, but if the pork industry goes down the road of gene editing, these benefits will materialize. Nutritious feed, enhanced immune system of the pigs, disease resistance, particularly with PRRS. We did a lot of research on PRRS. That is terrible. That is absolutely terrible. Environmental impact, increased productivity. Is that fair? Okay. What's the problem with these? The consumer has a bit of skepticism in terms of how they perceive that messaging, okay? They see ethical concerns. A living creature, you're doing a lot of science and exploration on it, there's got to be some problems with it. And they believe you have a transparency messaging issue, okay? Right, wrong, or indifferent. And so I go back to all of those advantages. Let's go back. I go back to all those advantages. What's the problem with it? I would argue to you that I don't see anything that's consumer-led on it, okay? And when you have a initiative or a program or a process that's not consumer-led, you will always meet significant amount of resistance. What do I mean by that? When you think about the value chain between the pork industry and the produce industry, we have a very similar value chain, right? Starting from the inputs of natural resources all the way to the end consumer. Your benefits and your advantages of gene editing really hits the upstream of the value chain, where the examples that I showed you lead me to believe that the benefits and the advantages of gene-edited products within the produce space really touch the value of the downstream effect, meaning we're speaking to the customer better, or the consumer, I'm sorry, better than your industry. Thoughts on that? So where do we go from here? Number one, we think you need to enhance public understanding through educational initiatives, effectively communicate the responsible use of gene editing to address these ethical considerations that they have brewing in between their ears. Number two, we think you need to consider implementing clear labeling for gene-edited products. I would argue that someone in the audience is sitting there saying, well, we do. I would argue you're not getting credit for that. And then number three, develop positive consumer perceptions by understanding current gene-edited produce applications to draw those parallels. Okay, the intent was to talk for a little bit and then to open it up for Q&A and discussion. Thoughts on any of this? Yeah. Right. You had to ask the toughest question first, right? Yeah, because there's no blueprint to this. I think the argument often is chicken or egg. Do we go down the road of this process to understand the benefits to then educate, or do we educate first before we go down this road to understand the benefits? And I would argue that the answer probably lies somewhere in between. And then I would argue that other industries probably have had to do the same to some degree. The question really becomes is, what is the benefit? And if the benefit is only upstream, you will always meet resistance. Somehow you have to find that there's a benefit that touches the emotional cord of the consumer. I don't know, let's make up a benefit. Gene editing, because I'm not the expert like y'all are, gene editing will help with weight loss. Okay, that strikes the chord of the American consumer. How do you articulate the benefits of a scientific approach that appeals to what it is that they're looking for? So.
I appreciate your presentation, and that makes a lot of sense. Like the consumer says, what's in it for me? With the tomato, I get a spicy tomato. With the onion, I don't cry when I cook, or when my husband cooks. More appropriate. But the problems that we face is that the benefit for the consumer is that you have a healthier animal that doesn't break with PRRS. Antibiotic use, the number one reason for antibiotic use is because of viral infections such as PRRS. So that's one benefit. You have a healthier animal, less antibiotic use. The second one is welfare. Both of those two things are slippery slopes, because now it's, well, now tell me more about the welfare. Now tell me more about your antibiotic use. And so our pros to the consumer are also the things that we fight on a daily basis in our industry. So I'm sure that you don't have the answer for that, but that is, like, I understand the speak to the consumer. That's the problem that we have is those benefits are also what people focus on with us.
Yeah. I want to answer it the long way. Before we started this session, Shelby and I were sitting over at that table, and we were talking about doctors, and I think her question, I hope, Shelby, you don't mind me saying what your question is that she goes, why do Asian people want their children to be doctors so much? Now, it was totally appropriate for Shelby to ask that because my mom's Korean, and we have a couple other people on our team that are Asian, and we always have this conversation. It's crazy. But the point of that was to say, I don't know. I think in the past, doctors were always viewed to be like of elite status, right? They were super intelligent. They went years of schooling and then trialing and then practicing, and they're compensated very well, and they were seen to be of a different social status years ago. Not so much today was the meat of that conversation. And then we likened it to, that seems to have changed into more about science and research. It seems like that culture wants their children to be scientists and researchers to some degree in particular industries because there's some level of elite status and those people are viewed to be highly intelligent. My point on this story is to say all that seems to be of the past because today our access to information and our access to everything makes us skeptical more than ever before, right? Before, we used to trust everything the scientists told us. Before, we used to trust everything the doctor told us, and that's just simply not the case today. And so how do you create, or not create, but how do you start to understand what additional benefits are there that the consumer can attach themselves or bolt themselves onto to say, this is for me versus all the woes of you? That felt like a cop-out answer. Yeah, 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 that would be awesome. Yeah.
Maybe a little bit in the similar vein as it relates to as far as just the eating experience. You know, you think about the different avenues that we've gone down as far as trying to enhance the eating experience of pork, right? I mean, we've done a lot of work in the genetic space, we've done a lot of work in the nutrition space, and how do we try to drive more marbling into that product? And so, I mean, at times I've wondered, like, to the point as far as what is in it for the consumer. Is there a way that you can make better bacon? Is there a way that you can make a better pork chop? And I mean, certainly that's not where we're at today as it relates to the editing that's being worked on in current space. Because certainly from a herd health perspective, the purge resistance piece is significant to pig farmers in general. But I wonder as far as like at what point some of these other angles will make some sense to also incorporate, because I'm assuming that the opportunities are nearly endless. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. You know, we just put up a couple of items. I think we showed 6 items, and there's so many more. And we didn't even talk about GMO products, but there's quite a few GMO products in the marketplace today that the consumer's just not aware are GMO. You know, most of the papayas that are in your grocery stores are GMO. And, you know, I think the common sense in many of us is to say that if consumers are resistant to GMO, why are they accepting, well, this is a knowledge issue, right? This is a transparency issue. I mean, think about corn. If we can stamp GMO on any product more than others, it would be corn. But there seems to be some either level of acceptance or a lack of knowledge issue to it. And what we're seeing, I think, going back to the presentation is, if you can clear up that transparency and start to talk to consumers to a greater rate, will they accept it? And I think maybe another good example to cite is, right now in the marketplace, you see a pink pineapple. And a press release came out, I don't know, a month ago about a red pineapple following it. And you look at these 2 items, and the label is very clear. This is genetically modified, okay? But they're in every grocery store today. Everybody's carrying them. And retailers are not going to carry a product just because. There has to be some demand to it. And demand is consumer-led. And so the consumer is accepting of it to some degree. And I think it's because it hits on one of those qualifiers that we saw earlier. There's a benefit to the consumer that they can clearly attach themselves to.
Are there market space assessments, like test pools, like maybe talk through like how different products have gotten into the marketplace in some of the avenues, because when I think about it from a pork perspective, I think about how it's like once the genie's out of the bottle, it's kind of hard to put them back in, right? So like, how do we have some level of confidence of how things will be played out so that we don't have to try and play Monday morning quarterback?
Yeah.
Say, oh, if we'd only known, if we should have done this, coulda, woulda. How do we best position ourselves for the potential introduction of a product like this into the marketplace?
Yeah, and forgive me if this assumption is incorrect, but I'm assuming that you have some folks that are lobbying Washington to some degree in terms of decision makers to be advocates of certain methods or not. Okay. Now, what it seems to have worked real well for our industry is there's quite a large group that's in Washington all the time talking about the advancement of technology in the fresh produce space. And that's all under the guise of things that we talked earlier about, sustainability, climate change, all the things that politicians want to attach themselves to in terms of being advocates of their constituents, right? So I would say maybe that's one tactic, is to look at that. And we can probably cite a couple of examples that have found themselves into the marketplace because of something like that. Well, maybe one example is a GMO product was announced a couple of months ago from a company that has been working on it for 5 years, and it's a purple tomato. Okay, the antioxidants in it are through the roof of any other product that can be purchased in the produce department, more than blueberries, more than grapes. And so there's a health benefit. And you know, the average consumer loves the word antioxidants. Their consumption of wine goes up because they see it as a health benefit of some kind, right? Guilty as charged. But I would argue that that company did a great job of building advocates at the advocacy level to go and advocate for them at the federal level, to start to open up these possibilities to market their products appropriately.
Sure.
Yeah.
Very good. Oh, just a second.
Have any kind of ballpark data that the produce industry has done on consumer segmentation in terms of how many people are actually kind of the hard skeptics that are out there versus people that are in some sort of persuadable middle? I mean, if you think about it, our business, if there's people that I've already decided I'm not going to eat meat, then they're out. But then of everybody else that eats meat, sometimes I think we get really preoccupied about a very loud 5 or 10% of people. But in fact, the majority of people are actually open for persuasion or totally fine with it. And I wonder if there's any parallel of, 80-20 rule or something like that you think of in the produce business.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. As you were asking that, where my mind went to is, we don't have the complexity that you have. You're going up against two behemoth industries in terms of competition on who lands on the consumer's plate every night, right? We don't have that challenge in our industry. I guess you can look at it from a micro level, you may. Is it going to be apples or grapes? One's going to cannibalize the other, but not to the degree that you do. So I just call that out to say, while we don't have statistics that I can cite off the top of my head, I got to believe that the statistics are probably going to point to something pretty broad and diverse in our industry to mean the definition of quality and freshness to all of us is differing regardless of our income level or ethnicity or any other stat that we can attach ourselves to. And the reason I say that is there's some of us that want more shelf life. There's some of us that want more eating experience. There's some of us that want aesthetics, the way it looks. There's some of us that measure quality and freshness by the way it sounds. And so that differing definition is hard to solve. And so I think the examples that we showed there earlier is to say, how do you take certain products that may have certain attributes that are broadly reaching to magnify that? Yeah.
Just tagging on that last question, do you have a sense or any research that indicates are consumers discriminating between the terms gene editing and gene modified?
None come to mind, but if you're asking me for instinct, yeah, I think so. I think, all of the bad press in the last decade or two about GMO, whether it's pesticides, whether it's varieties, whether it's failed experiments, probably are guiding people to be anti-anything that's altered from its original state. I say that because you'd be amazed how many people are confused about just natural cross-pollination or cross-breeding of products. And so an example of that is I was in a conversation years ago with a person about cotton candy grapes. They're not GMO, they're not gene edited. That's through typical cross breeding programs to develop that flavor profile. But the average consumer sees that and generally speaking, immediately associates a quote-unquote bad process to it. So that would be the way that I answer your question, is how do we start to educate?
Very good. Well, let's give Randy a round of applause.